Beijing, October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong stands at the gate of heavenly peace and proclaims the founding of the People's Republic of China. He is 55 years old. He has just completed what most military historians assess as the greatest revolutionary military achievement of the 20th century, the transformation of a guerrilla movement that was nearly destroyed on multiple occasions, that was forced into the famous Long March retreat of 1934 and 1935, that reduced its forces from roughly 100,000 soldiers to a small fraction of that number, into the dominant military and political force in the world's most populous country. The civil war against Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government is, by any conventional military assessment, over. The People's Liberation Army has swept through China with a speed and a completeness that exceeded even the most optimistic projections of Mao's own planning. Shanghai fell in May 1949. Nanjing, the nationalist capital, fell in April. Beijing had been taken in January. The nationalist forces, which had benefited from American military support, and which, at least on paper, had possessed substantial advantages in equipment and in numbers, had collapsed under the combination of military defeat, mass defection, and the specific political failure of a government that had lost the specific mandate of popular legitimacy that Confucian Chinese political theory had always identified as the foundational requirement for legitimate rule. Chiang Kai-shek and the remnants of his government have fled to Taiwan, the island province approximately 180 kilometers off the coast of Fujian, taking with them the National Treasury's gold reserves, approximately 600,000 nationalist troops and their dependents, and the specific institutional apparatus of a government that now governs only an island. By every conventional logic of military campaigns, this should be the next and final step. Take Taiwan. Complete the revolution. Reunify China under communist rule. It didn't happen. 25 years later, when Mao died in 1976, Taiwan was still independent. It remains independent today. And the specific reasons why Mao, having just achieved one of the most complete military victories in modern history, was unable to take the last piece of territory he needed to complete the job, constitute one of the most analytically rich and most consequential episodes of strategic failure in the entire history of the Cold War. This is the complete story of why Mao failed to take Taiwan after winning China, the 5 distinct factors that prevented the operation, the specific manner in which each contributed to the outcome, and what the entire episode reveals about the specific limits of revolutionary military success and the particular ways in which the final step of a military campaign can be fundamentally different in character from every step that preceded it. Part 1. The nature of the problem, the specific character of the military problem that Taiwan presented to Mao in 1949 was fundamentally different from the character of the military problem that the civil war against the nationalists on the Chinese mainland had presented, and understanding this specific difference is the starting point for understanding why the mainland campaign's success did not simply translate into success in completing the revolution's final step. The PLA's specific military genius across the Civil War had been the genius of land warfare conducted across the enormous geographic depth and human mass of the Chinese mainland, the specific combination of guerrilla operations, people's war doctrine, the political mobilization of the peasantry, and the eventual conventional military operations that had swept the nationalist forces from field to field and city to city, exploiting the specific vulnerabilities of a government that had lost popular legitimacy and whose military forces were subject to the particular demoralization that the loss of political legitimacy produces. These specific capabilities, developed across more than 2 decades of revolutionary warfare in the specific conditions of continental China, were precisely the capabilities that the Taiwan problem did not require or permit. Taiwan was an island. It was separated from the Fujian coast by the Taiwan Strait, approximately 180 kilometers of open water at its narrowest point. The crossing of 180 kilometers of open water with the military forces required to overcome the nationalist garrison defending Taiwan, now numbering approximately 600,000 troops who had the specific motivation of people defending their last redoubt rather than the specific demoralization of people defending a government they had stopped believing in. Required capabilities that the PLA did not possess in October 1949. It required a naval force capable of transporting and protecting an amphibious landing of sufficient scale to overwhelm the nationalist defenses. It required an air force capable of contesting air superiority over the Taiwan Strait and over the landing beaches, preventing the ROC's own air force from destroying the landing force while it was at its most vulnerable, in the open water and on the beaches. And it required the specific logistical capability to sustain a large military force across 180 kilometers of open water under combat conditions. The PLA in October 1949 possessed none of these capabilities in any form remotely adequate to the scale of the operation the Taiwan problem required. This specific capability gap was not a minor technical deficiency that additional training or additional time could easily address. It was a fundamental mismatch between the specific capabilities that had produced the Civil War's success. Land warfare capabilities developed across 2 decades of revolutionary conflict, and the specific capabilities that the Taiwan problem actually required, maritime and amphibious warfare capabilities that the PLA had essentially never needed and had therefore essentially never developed. The specific geography of the Taiwan Strait compounded this capability problem in specific ways that are worth examining directly. The strait is not simply 180 kilometers of open water, it is 180 kilometers of open water in which weather and tidal conditions are frequently challenging, in which the dominant wind patterns across certain seasons make sustained amphibious operations particularly difficult, and in which the specific geography of the Fujian coast, with its complex pattern of offshore islands and tidal mudflats, creates logistical complications for assembling and launching a large amphibious force that the relatively straightforward river crossings of the mainland campaign had not required managing. The island of Taiwan itself, moreover, was not the flat coastal terrain that the simplest versions of an amphibious landing scenario might suggest. Its western coast, facing the strait, presented the most accessible beaches, but these beaches were defended by prepared positions and, increasingly after 1949, by nationalist forces who had every incentive to prepare the kind of layered coastal defense that had proven devastatingly effective at Kinmen. The transition from a continental revolutionary army to an amphibious force capable of the largest amphibious operation in East Asian history was not a transition that could be accomplished in months, and months were what Mao had. Part 2. The Naval Problem. Fishing boats and revolutionaries. The specific naval and amphibious capability problem that confronted the PLA in 1949 is most directly illustrated by what the PLA actually had available for amphibious operations at this point in its development, and what the Battle of Gunung II in October 1949 demonstrated about the specific consequences of attempting a major amphibious operation with those inadequate capabilities. The PLA in 1949 had what one historian aptly described as a navy consisting largely of fishing boats and junks. It had no significant ocean-going warships, no landing craft designed for amphibious operations, no naval gunfire support capability, and no meaningful capacity to protect an amphibious landing force from interdiction by an opposing naval force or air force while it was crossing open water. The specific significance of the Battle of Gunung II, fought from October 25 to 27, 1949. Just weeks before Mao's proclamation of the People's Republic, illustrates this naval problem with the specific clarity of a military disaster that leaves no ambiguity about the lessons it teaches. Kinmen, also known as Quemoy, is a small island group approximately 6 miles off the coast of Fujian, immediately opposite the port city of Xiamen. It is not Taiwan itself, but it was understood by both sides as a strategically critical stepping stone. As long as the nationalists held Kinmen, they controlled the sea approaches to Xiamen and could interdict any PLA amphibious operation directed at Taiwan. The PLA's 10th Army Corps, under General Ye Fei, had been directed to capture Kinmen as the first step in the operational sequence that would eventually bring the PLA to the shores of Taiwan. The specific PLA force assembled for the Kinmen operation was approximately 9,000 experienced infantry troops from the 28th and 29th Armies. Transported in approximately 300 wooden fishing boats and civilian vessels that had been requisitioned from local fishermen, many of whom had hidden or scuttled their boats to avoid being conscripted into an operation they understood was dangerous. The PLA planners had estimated that Kinmen was defended by approximately 12,000 nationalist troops. They were wrong. Chiang Kai-shek, understanding the strategic importance of Kinmen as the gateway to Taiwan's maritime defense, had reinforced it heavily. The actual garrison was approximately 40,000 troops, including reinforcements that arrived from the 12th Army Corps just as the PLA assault was beginning, who were equipped with M5A1 Stuart tanks, artillery. And the specific advantage of defenders who had laid 7,455 landmines along the beaches and constructed approximately 200 bunkers. The PLA assault went in on the night of October 24 to 25. The first wave of approximately 9,000 troops in their wooden fishing boats crossed Xiamen Bay in darkness, due to the crudeness of their craft, choppy waters, and tidal conditions. Many of the boats were scattered, carrying the troops past their intended landing point at Longkou and depositing them further northwest toward the beach at Guningtou. Arriving at high tide, many of the landing vessels became caught on submerged anti-amphibious obstacles and were immobilized on the beach, where they sat as the tide receded, stranded and unable to return to the mainland to bring additional waves. This is the specific operational detail that made the Battle of Guningtou a military catastrophe. The 9,000 troops who landed were stranded on the island with no possibility of reinforcement or evacuation, because the boats that had brought them were either destroyed by ROC naval gunfire and airstrikes or left stranded on the beach by the receding tide. The ROC forces, alerted by the sounds of the landing, opened fire with machine guns, artillery, and mortars. They then counterattacked with their tanks, which the PLA's landing force had no armor of its own to counter. ROC Air Force bombers and fighters, operating from Taiwan and enjoying complete air superiority over the battle, struck both the landing force on the island and the transport vessels attempting to bring additional waves from Xiamen. By the morning of October 27, after 3 days of intense fighting, the PLA's entire landing force on Kinmen had been destroyed. Of the 9,086 PLA soldiers who had landed, approximately 5,175 were captured and the remainder were killed. Not a single PLA soldier returned to the mainland from the Kinmen battle. General Ye Fei subsequently wrote to Mao accepting responsibility for the defeat and requesting punishment, attributing the disaster to the shortage of landing vessels and the complete absence of naval and air support that any viable amphibious operation required. Mao declined to punish him, apparently accepting that the defeat reflected structural limitations of the PLA's naval capability rather than individual command failure. The Battle of Guningtou was the first significant PLA defeat in the entire Civil War. Its specific lessons were unmistakable: without a navy, without air support, and without proper landing craft, amphibious operations of the scale that Taiwan required were not feasible. The fishing boats that had worked well enough for crossing rivers during the mainland campaign were not assets that could carry a revolution across 180 kilometers of contested open water to a heavily defended island. Part 3. The intelligence failure. The spy who couldn't be saved. While the PLA's naval and amphibious capability problem was the most fundamental structural obstacle to a Taiwan invasion, it was not the only factor that prevented the operation from being launched in the months between the Civil War's conclusion and the outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950. A second and less well-known factor was the specific intelligence dimension of the Taiwan problem, the systematic dismantling of the PLA's espionage network inside Taiwan by Chiang Kai-shek's counterintelligence apparatus. Mao had understood, with the specific intelligence that had organized his entire approach to the Civil War. that a major amphibious operation against Taiwan would require not simply military force but the specific intelligence infrastructure that effective large-scale operations require, information about nationalist military dispositions on the island, the locations of key defensive positions, the organization and capability of the ROC forces, and, ideally, the kind of fifth column capability inside Taiwan that could disrupt the defenses at the critical moment of the landing. For this purpose, Mao had appointed Chai Shaogan, a man he had reportedly hand-picked while Chai was a university student in Shanghai, as the PLA's intelligence chief for the Taiwan operation. Kai was a native of Taiwan and a committed communist, and by the summer of 1949 he had built, from his position in Taipei operating undercover, a spy network of reportedly 1,100 agents. By December 1949, he was confident enough in his network's capabilities to report to his superiors that he would be ready to provide full intelligence and fifth column support for the invasion by April 1950. The month he calculated would offer the best weather conditions for a crossing of the Taiwan Strait. Among his most valuable assets was General Wu Shi, a two-star ROC general who had retreated to Taipei from Nanjing and who had been assigned to the Ministry of National Defense's General Staff Department, a position that gave him access to war plans and other highly sensitive information about the ROC's defensive arrangements. The network's unraveling began in September 1949 when Chiang's counterintelligence operation in Keelung uncovered a spy ring and an underground printing press. This initial breakthrough allowed counterintelligence officers to trace connections and identify the official in charge of PLA underground intelligence work in southern Taiwan, who was arrested in Kaohsiung in November. The network then came apart with extraordinary speed. One compromised agent led to the next, and by January 1950, Taiwanese counterintelligence had identified and located Chai Shaogan himself. He was arrested in his Taipei residence, a surprise that even the seasoned intelligence professional could not anticipate or prepare for. The collapse of the intelligence network eliminated the specific fifth column capability that Kai had been building and that had been a significant element of the invasion plan's operational concept. Without agents inside Taiwan who could provide real-time intelligence about defensive positions and who could conduct sabotage and disruption operations at the critical moment of the landing, the operational planning for the invasion was fundamentally compromised. Chiang Kai-shek had made counterintelligence his highest priority upon arriving in Taiwan, and the specific success of his security apparatus in dismantling the PLA's underground network inside Taiwan added a further specific obstacle to the invasion's feasibility, even if the PLA could solve its naval and amphibious capability problems. It would be going in without the intelligence preparation that effective large-scale amphibious operations required. Part 4. The American Factor. A changing calculation, the specific American dimension of the Taiwan problem in 1949, is one of the most analytically interesting and most historically consequential factors in the story of why Mao failed to take Taiwan. Because the American position on Taiwan's defense underwent a dramatic and consequential reversal in the specific period between the end of the Civil War and the outbreak of the Korean War. In early 1950, the American position on Taiwan was not the position of a country committed to defending the island at all costs. The Truman administration had, by late 1949 and early 1950, essentially concluded that Taiwan's fall to the communists was likely and perhaps inevitable, and that the United States did not have sufficient strategic interest in the island's independence to justify the costs of defending it. The State Department's China White Paper, published in August 1949, had effectively acknowledged the nationalist government's failure and had attributed it to the nationalist government's own specific political and military shortcomings rather than to American inadequacy. Secretary of State Dean Ackerson's accompanying letter had suggested that Taiwan's survival was ultimately dependent on forces beyond American control. The NSC 37 policy papers of 1949 had debated the Taiwan question extensively, with the conclusions generally supporting a policy of watchful waiting rather than active commitment to the island's defense. President Truman stated publicly in January 1950 that the United States would not provide military aid or military advice to the Chinese forces on Taiwan, a statement whose specific implication was that the United States was not going to defend Taiwan if the PLA moved against it. This specific American position was understood in both Beijing and Taipei as suggesting that the United States had effectively written off Taiwan, at least in the short term. And it was this specific American position, combined with the PLA's developing invasion planning, that organized the specific window of opportunity that Mao's military was attempting to exploit in the first half of 1950. Then, Korea changed everything. When North Korean forces invaded South Korea on June 25, 1950, President Truman's response was immediate, and it extended beyond Korea itself. Within 2 days of the Korean invasion, Truman issued a statement announcing that the United States would not only defend South Korea, but would also order the U.S. 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Strait to prevent any PLA attack on Taiwan. The specific reasoning was explicit. The Korean invasion had demonstrated that communist aggression in Asia was not a series of isolated national revolutionary movements, but a coordinated campaign that the United States needed to counter across the entire region. A Taiwan that fell while the United States was fighting in Korea would represent a specific strategic defeat whose cumulative effect on the American position in Asia could not be accepted. The deployment of the 7th Fleet to the Taiwan Strait was, in its specific military character, an absolute barrier to any PLA amphibious operation against Taiwan. The 7th Fleet in 1950 represented a naval force of a qualitatively different order from anything the PLA could contest. Aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and the specific air power that carrier-based aviation provided, organized precisely for the interdiction role that defending the Taiwan Strait against a crossing required. Any PLA amphibious operation that attempted to cross the Taiwan Strait in the face of the 7th Fleet would have been destroyed in the water, with a certainty that the Guningtou experiences lessons about the vulnerability of wooden fishing boats to naval gunfire and air interdiction already illustrated at smaller scale. The Korean War had, in the span of 2 days, transformed the American position on Taiwan from watchful disengagement to active military commitment, and had placed in the Taiwan Strait a naval force that made any near-term PLA invasion attempt an operational impossibility. Part 5. The Korean Distraction. A revolution consuming its own resources. The specific impact of the Korean War on the PLA's Taiwan invasion planning was not simply the strategic consequence of the 7th Fleet's deployment. It was also the specific operational consequence of what China's intervention in the Korean War in October 1950 did to the specific military resources that had been earmarked for the Taiwan operation. The specific internal debate within Chinese leadership about whether to intervene in Korea, documented through both Chinese and Soviet archival sources that have become available in the post-Cold War period, reveals the particular complexity of the decision that Mao made in October 1950. The military argument against intervention was substantial. Chinese forces had been fighting continuously since 1927. The military was in the process of reorganizing and modernizing. The specific capability development for the Taiwan invasion had barely begun. An intervention in Korea would mean confronting the most powerful military in the world with forces that were, in terms of equipment, air power, and logistical support, profoundly disadvantaged. The military argument for intervention was organized primarily around security. Mao and the senior leadership assessed that American forces advancing to the Yalu River, the border between China and Korea, represented a direct threat to Chinese security that could not be accepted regardless of its cost. The specific memory of foreign military presence on Chinese soil, organized around more than a century of the specific national humiliation that the series on the Chinese Revolution has examined, made the presence of American forces on China's northeastern border an intolerable provocation that the revolution's foundational nationalism could not accommodate. The scale of the Chinese intervention was enormous. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army crossed the Yalu River in late October 1950 under Peng Dehuai's command, comprising hundreds of thousands of troops organized across multiple army groups. These were not second-tier forces, many of the best-trained and best-led formations of the PLA. Formations that had been participating in the training and preparation for the Taiwan operation were redirected to Korea. The 3rd Field Army, which had been the formation most directly associated with planning the Taiwan invasion, saw many of its best units diverted to the Korean theater. The 3 years of the Korean War, from October 1950 to the armistice of July 1953, consumed Chinese military resources at a scale and a rate that foreclosed any possibility of simultaneously pursuing the Taiwan operation. The logistics of supporting a major military force across several hundred kilometers of Korean peninsula required the specific organizational and resource commitments that left nothing available for the entirely separate and entirely different logistical challenge of building and supporting an amphibious force in the Taiwan Strait. The specific human cost of the Korean intervention to the PLA further deepened the resource problem. Chinese casualties in Korea, while the precise figures remain debated among historians, were substantial. Estimates range from several 100,000 to over 1 million total casualties, representing a significant proportion of the experienced military manpower that the Civil War campaigns had developed. The specific loss of experienced officers and non-commissioned officers, whose particular institutional value could not be easily replaced, was especially significant for the specific capability development that the Taiwan operation required. China's intervention in Korea did, as this series has examined in detail in its treatment of Peng Dehuai's command of the Korean intervention, demonstrate that the PLA was capable of fighting the world's most powerful military to a strategic stalemate. But it did so at a specific cost that included not just the immediate casualties, but the specific opportunity cost of 3 years of military development directed entirely at the Korean problem rather than at the Taiwan problem. The specific interaction between the Korean commitment and the Taiwan problem illustrates a pattern this series has documented in other contexts of revolutionary states that find their most consequential strategic goals deferred by the specific operational requirements of the immediate crises that their revolutionary politics generate. The revolution that had succeeded in China had, through the specific chain of events connecting Chinese support for North Korea to Kim Il-sung's invasion to the American decision to defend Taiwan, created the specific international environment that made the revolution's completion impossible for a generation. Part 6. The First Taiwan Strait Crisis and what it confirmed. After the Korean War armistice in July 1953, Mao's attention returned to Taiwan and the specific question of whether the conditions that had prevented the invasion had changed sufficiently to permit a renewed attempt. The first Taiwan Strait crisis of 1954 and 1955 was the specific test of this question, and its outcome confirmed what the combination of the Gunning II defeat, the Korean War, and the 7th Fleet's deployment had already established, that the military conditions for a successful PLA invasion of Taiwan remained fundamentally unfavorable. The crisis was organized around the PLA's artillery campaign against the offshore islands, particularly Kinmen and Matsu, which had remained under ROC control since the Gunning II battle 5 years earlier. The PLA's bombardment of these islands, combined with an operation that captured the Yajiangshan Islands from the ROC in January 1955, was partly designed to test the extent of American commitment to Taiwan's defense and partly to pressure the nationalist positions in the Taiwan Strait. The American response to the first Taiwan Strait crisis was decisive. Congress passed the Formosa Resolution in January 1955, authorizing the president to use armed forces to protect Taiwan and the Pescadores, and Secretary of State John Foster Dulles made specific and explicit statements suggesting that the United States would use nuclear weapons to defend Taiwan if necessary. The Sino-American Mutual Defense Treaty, signed in December 1954, formalized the American commitment to Taiwan's defense in the specific institutional form that a treaty alliance represents, providing the explicit security guarantee that Chiang Kai-shek had been seeking since the Korean War had transformed the American position on Taiwan from disengagement to active commitment. The specific escalation dynamic of the first Taiwan Strait crisis, in which American nuclear threats produced the specific deterrent effect that prevented any further PLA military action against the offshore islands or against Taiwan itself, established the geopolitical framework within which the Taiwan question would remain frozen for the remainder of Mao's life. Any PLA military operation against Taiwan would now risk direct confrontation with a nuclear-armed superpower that had formally committed to Taiwan's defense. This specific calculation, whatever its specific moral and political complexities, was a calculation whose military implications were absolutely clear. The PLA in the mid-1950s was not a force that could contest American nuclear capability, and the specific military risk of an invasion attempt that might trigger nuclear retaliation was not a risk that any reasonable strategic calculation could endorse. Part 7. The Second Taiwan Strait Crisis and the limits of bombardment. Mao attempted one further significant military pressure on Taiwan during his lifetime, in the Second Taiwan Strait Crisis of 1958. And the specific character of this episode and its outcome illustrates the particular limits of the military options that remained available to him once the specific combination of American commitment and PLA capability limitations had foreclosed the invasion option. The 1958 crisis was organized around a massive artillery bombardment of Kinmen Island beginning on August 23, 1958. When PLA artillery opened fire with an extraordinary barrage, according to ROC records, approximately 57,000 shells were fired on the island in the first 2 days alone, with the total artillery barrage eventually extending to 44 consecutive days. The scale of the bombardment was genuinely extraordinary, and it reflected Mao's specific political objectives in the crisis: to pressure the United States into either abandoning its commitment to the offshore islands or accepting a negotiated settlement that would advance PLA control over the approaches to Taiwan, while avoiding the specific direct military confrontation with American forces that an actual invasion attempt would produce. The specific outcome of the Second Taiwan Strait crisis confirmed what the first had established. The United States responded by deploying additional naval forces to the Taiwan Strait, escorting rock supply convoys to Kinmen with American warships, and making explicit statements about the American commitment to the island's defense. The rock garrison on Kinmen, supplied by sea under American escort and armed with American artillery and equipment, held the island against the bombardment without territory changing hands. The 44-day artillery barrage failed to dislodge the rock garrison. The political pressure failed to induce American disengagement from the offshore islands' commitment. And the specific military reality was confirmed. The PLA could bombard Kinmen from the mainland, but it could not take Kinmen by amphibious assault as long as American naval power in the Taiwan Strait provided the specific deterrent that made such an assault prohibitively costly. Mao's specific response to the failure of the bombardment campaign to achieve its political objectives was the specific response that this series has documented in other cases of revolutionary leaders confronting the specific limits of their military capability. He did not launch the invasion that the bombardment had been designed to prepare or to cover for. He eventually settled, in a decision whose specific irony was visible at the time and has been commented upon extensively since, on a pattern of alternating day artillery fire at Kinmen, firing on odd-numbered days and ceasing on even-numbered days, that allowed rock supply ships to resupply the island on even-numbered days, and that converted the bombardment from a military operation into a political ritual of sorts, a specific expression of the Parsi's formal claim to sovereignty over Taiwan and the offshore islands that continued for the next 20 years without any military consequence. This specific resolution, the transformation of what had been a military operation into a political ritual of alternating day bombardment, is the most visible expression of the fundamental strategic stalemate that Mao's failure to take Taiwan had produced, a situation in which the PRCs formally claimed Taiwan as a province of China, in which the ROC formally claimed to be the legitimate government of all China, in which neither side's military capability was sufficient to impose its claim on the other, and in which the specific American commitment to Taiwan's defense had, converted what Mao had understood as the final step of the revolution into a frozen conflict whose specific resolution would require political and diplomatic means rather than the military means that had completed every other step of the revolutionary campaign. Part 8. What Chiang Kai-shek did with the time while examining why Mao failed to take Taiwan, this script must also examine what Chiang Kai-shek did with the specific window that Mao's failure to close immediately and the Korean War's strategic intervention provided. Because the story of Taiwan's survival is not simply the story of PLA capability limitations and American intervention. It is also the story of what Chiang Kai-shek and the ROC government did on Taiwan across the years and decades after their arrival. Chiang had arrived in Taiwan with approximately 600,000 military personnel and their dependents, the remnants of the Nationalist government's civilian administration, approximately 300,000 additional civilians who had fled the mainland with the government, the National Treasury's gold reserves that had been transferred to Taiwan ahead of the mainland's fall, and the specific institutions of the Republic of China government, including universities, cultural institutions, and administrative bodies that had been systematically transferred to Taiwan across the preceding months. He had also arrived having made counterintelligence and internal security his absolute top priority, understanding with the clarity of someone who had just watched his government collapse partly from within that the specific vulnerability of Taiwan to PLA intelligence penetration was the most immediate threat to its survival, even if the direct military invasion did not materialize. The aggressive counterintelligence program that dismantled Kai Shaogan's spy network was the first expression of this priority, but it extended beyond intelligence operations to the broader restructuring of the ROC's internal security apparatus in ways that made Taiwan considerably more resistant to the specific combination of fifth-column subversion and external military pressure that PLA planning had been designed around. On the economic front, Chiang implemented, beginning in the early 1950s, a land reform program that redistributed agricultural land from landlords to tenant farmers, eliminating the specific social grievance, the landlord-tenant relationship that communist organizing had exploited so effectively on the mainland. That had provided one of the foundations of PLA political mobilization. This land reform, combined with the specific economic development policies that the ROC government implemented across the 1950s and 1960s with American economic assistance, produced the trajectory of economic growth that this series has examined in other scripts as the Taiwan Miracle, the rapid and sustained economic development that transformed Taiwan from a relatively poor colonial economy into one of the most dynamic emerging economies in Asia, with per capita income levels that far exceeded those of the mainland and that provided the ROC government with the specific economic and material legitimacy that Chiang's mainland government had conspicuously lacked. The specific economic development policies that the ROC government implemented across the 1950s and 1960s with American economic assistance are worth examining in some detail, because the specific trajectory of Taiwan's economic development is directly relevant to understanding what Mao's failure actually cost in geopolitical and comparative political terms. American economic assistance to Taiwan began flowing immediately after the Korean War transformed the American strategic commitment to the island. The Joint Commission on Rural Reconstruction, which had been established in 1948 but which became most consequential in Taiwan, provided the specific technical and financial assistance for the land reform that dismantled the landlord-tenant system and that gave Taiwan's rural population a genuine material stake in the new order on the island. Chiang also made the specific decision, shaped partly by the mainland experience and partly by American advice, to allow a significant degree of technocratic economic management that his mainland government had never permitted. Economists trained in the United States, including K.Y. Yin and the Economic Reform Group that organized Taiwan's export-oriented industrialization in the 1960s, were given the specific institutional authority to implement economic policies based on economic analysis rather than political ideology. The specific economic results, beginning with the import substitution industrialization of the 1950s and accelerating with the export-oriented industrialization of the 1960s and beyond, were the results that this series has examined in its treatment of Deng Xiaoping's challenge to the Stalinist economic model, a rapid, sustained economic growth trajectory that transformed Taiwan's per capita income from roughly comparable to the mainland's in 1949 to enormously higher than the mainland's by the 1970s, creating the specific material comparison between communist mainland governance and ROC Taiwan governance, whose implications for the mainland's domestic political legitimacy were not lost on Mao or on his successors. This specific economic divergence, produced by the specific institutional choices each side made with the resources and the security environment available to them, is one of the deepest and most consequential consequences of Mao's failure to close the revolution in 1949 and 1950. A Taiwan that fell rapidly to the plough in 1949 or 1950 would have been absorbed into the specific economic and institutional trajectory that the mainland followed across the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. A Taiwan that survived instead became the specific comparative case that made the differences in economic performance between communist and non-communist governance visible to anyone willing to look at the available evidence. Part 9. The 5 factors and their interaction. The specific story of why Mao failed to take Taiwan after winning China is, as this script has argued through its preceding sections, not the story of a single decisive factor, but the story of 5 distinct factors whose specific interaction across the period from 1949 to the mid-1950s collectively foreclosed the invasion option that had appeared straightforwardly available in October 1949. The first factor was the PLA's fundamental amphibious capability gap, the specific absence of the naval power, the landing craft, the air cover, and the logistical capability that crossing 180 kilometers of contested open water with a military force large enough to overwhelm the Nationalist garrison required. This was the foundational military problem, illustrated most brutally by the Gunung II disaster of October 1949, and it was a problem that required years to address even with Soviet assistance. The second factor was the intelligence failure, the systematic dismantling of Chai Shaogan's spy network by Chiang's counterintelligence apparatus, which eliminated the 5th column capability that the invasion plan's operational concept had incorporated, and which left the PLA without the specific intelligence preparation that an operation of this complexity required. The third factor was the American reversal, the transformation of the American position on Taiwan from watchful disengagement in early 1950 to active military commitment after the Korean War began in June 1950, and specifically the deployment of the 7th Fleet to the Taiwan Strait that placed an insuperable naval barrier between the PLA and Taiwan. The fourth factor was Korea itself, the specific redirection of Chinese military resources from the Taiwan problem to the Korean intervention from October 1950 onward, consuming for 3 years the military personnel, equipment, and political attention that might otherwise have been directed at the Taiwan problem, and producing the 1954 Mutual Defense Treaty that institutionalized American commitment to Taiwan's defense. The fifth factor was what Chiang Kai-shek and the ROC government built on Taiwan in the time that these 4 factors provided: the specific institutional development, economic growth, and genuine popular legitimacy that made Taiwan a significantly more defensible entity than the mainland nationalist government had been. And that provided the material and institutional foundation for a sustained defense of Taiwan's independence that remained viable even as American commitment evolved across subsequent decades. The specific interaction among these 5 factors is what makes the Taiwan question analytically interesting beyond its immediate historical significance. Each of the 5 factors was individually significant. Together, they created a specific configuration in which the window for a successful military resolution of the Taiwan problem, if such a window ever existed at all, given the PLA's amphibious capability limitations, closed permanently within the first year after the mainland's fall. Part 10. The Strategic Lesson. What Kinman should have taught the Battle of Gunning II should have been the specific event that prevented Mao from ever seriously planning an amphibious invasion of Taiwan in the time frame he was actually working with. Because its specific lessons about the requirements of amphibious warfare were lessons that any strategic planner with direct operational experience of the battle could not have missed. The lesson was not simply that amphibious operations are more difficult than land operations, a lesson that the entire history of 20th century amphibious warfare, from Gallipoli to Normandy, had already documented exhaustively. The lesson was the specific character of what the PLA lacked and what it would need to acquire, not just transport vessels, but air cover, naval gunfire support, proper landing craft with ramps that could discharge troops on the beach, and the specific combined arms coordination between sea, air, and land forces that an opposed amphibious landing of the scale Taiwan required actually demanded. Mao understood this, at least intellectually, in the sense that his subsequent military planning incorporated Soviet assistance as the specific mechanism through which the PLA would acquire the naval capabilities it needed. Soviet advisors were requested for naval development. Soviet equipment was sought. The specific timeline of the invasion planning was built around the timeline required to develop these capabilities. What the planning did not adequately account for was the specific fragility of the window within which these capabilities needed to be developed and deployed. The PLA had from October 1949 to June 1950, 8 months, in which the specific combination of American disengagement and PLA developing capabilities might have permitted an invasion attempt, and even within that 8-month window, the Gunning II disaster's lessons about minimum capability requirements suggested that any operation launched in this period would have faced enormous risks. The Korean War's outbreak in June 1950 closed the window before the capability development could reach even the minimum threshold, and the specific institutional commitment of American military power to the Taiwan Strait that the Korean War produced ensured that the window remained closed for the remainder of Mao's lifetime. Part 11. The long-term consequence, the frozen conflict, the specific failure to take Taiwan in the window available between 1949 and 1950 created a geopolitical situation whose specific character has organized the East Asian security landscape for more than 7 decades and that continues to shape the most significant geopolitical risks in the current international environment. Taiwan's survival in that specific window produced, across the following decades, the specific institutional and economic development that this script has examined in its treatment of what Chiang Kai-shek built on the island with the time Mao's failure provided. The Taiwan miracle, the economic transformation that made Taiwan one of the most prosperous and most technologically sophisticated societies in Asia, was built on the foundation of the security that survived Mao's inability to complete the revolution's final step. The specific diplomatic situation that the frozen conflict created has organized some of the most consequential international relationships of the past 7 decades. The American commitment to Taiwan's defense, formalized in the 1954 treaty and maintained in modified form through the Taiwan Relations Act after American diplomatic recognition shifted to the PRC in 1979. The specific diplomatic fiction of strategic ambiguity through which the United States has maintained relations with both the PARCs and Taiwan without formally recognizing either's claim against the other, and the specific tension between the PARC's formal position that Taiwan is an inalienable part of Chinese territory and Taiwan's practical independence as a self-governing democracy with its own institutions, its own military, and its own international relationships. The specific irony of Mao's failure to complete the revolution, examined in the analytical framework this series has applied to the relationship between revolutionary success and revolutionary completion across multiple historical cases, is that the failure was produced by exactly the kind of operational overconfidence that had never characterized his approach to the mainland campaign. Mao's genius in the mainland civil war had been the specific and patient calibration of means to ends, the willingness to retreat when retreat preserved the force, to wait when waiting produced better conditions, to fight when the conditions were genuinely favorable, rather than simply because the ideological momentum of the revolution demanded immediate action. This specific strategic patience had organized the Long March's survival, the Yan'an consolidation, and the eventually overwhelming civil war campaigns. In the Taiwan problem, this specific strategic patience apparently failed him. Or rather, the specific operational conditions of the Taiwan problem, the narrow window available for action, and the rapid change in the external environment produced by Korea meant that the patient calibration of means to ends that had organized the mainland campaign's success was simply unavailable in the form and the time frame that the Taiwan problem required. He had the revolutionary will, he had the political legitimacy, he had the military forces in terms of personnel. He didn't have the boats, and by the time he was developing the boats, America had deployed the 7th Fleet. The revolution, whose final step was separated from its preceding steps by 180 kilometers of open water, was a revolution that stopped at the Strait. Part 12, the lesson for this series, the specific story of why Mao failed to take Taiwan after winning China, provides this series with a case study in a pattern that the series has examined in several other contexts, the specific manner in which revolutionary military success creates its own specific strategic problem by producing the conditions that make the revolution's completion simultaneously most urgent and most difficult. The mainland campaign's overwhelming success had created, by October 1949, the specific combination of factors that made the Taiwan problem both maximally urgent and maximally difficult. Maximally urgent, because the defeat of the mainland campaign meant that Taiwan was now the only remaining obstacle to the revolution's completion, and maximally difficult, because the same campaign that had produced this urgency had consumed the specific years and specific resources that developing genuine amphibious capability would have required. The PLA that arrived on the Fujian coast in 1949 was the most battle-hardened and most tactically capable land force in Asia. It was, simultaneously, completely unprepared for the specific military challenge that the Taiwan problem presented. The specific capabilities that had made it formidable, the guerrilla warfare techniques, the political mobilization of the peasantry, the specific combined arms tactics of the later Civil War campaigns, were not capabilities that translated directly into amphibious warfare capability. The revolution that had succeeded by exploiting the specific vulnerabilities of its opponents, their political failures, their supply problems, their personnel quality, and eventually their sheer exhaustion, now faced an opponent who had escaped to the specific environment where the revolution's specific capabilities could not reach. This specific pattern, revolutionary success creating the conditions for the revolution's own strategic limitation, is the pattern that makes the Taiwan case analytically significant beyond its immediate geopolitical importance. Mao won the largest country in the world by population. He could not close the last 180 kilometers. Because those 180 kilometers required capabilities his revolution had never needed to develop in a time frame that the external environment foreclosed. Against an opponent who survived long enough to build the specific institutional and material foundations that made him much harder to defeat than he had been on the mainland. The civil war that ended in 1949 never formally ended. It simply moved to the water. And in the water, the specific genius of continental revolutionary warfare encountered its specific and permanent limit. That limit remains across the Taiwan Strait to this day.